Fire always makes a sound before it hurts you. Jada heard it, with splitting, glass popping, the low animal growl climbing up the walls, before she felt the heat clawing at her skin. She pressed her palms together, trembling, her pregnant belly pulling tight as smoke burned her lungs. Outside the window stood Seo Minji, calm as moonlight, her hand resting on the lock like it belonged there. Jada's lips formed the only words that mattered. Please, my baby. Minji turned the key, and just beyond her shoulder, frozen in the firelight, stood Go Young-jae, the man everyone in Korea's underworld once feared, watching his pregnant wife burn. Small pause. Someone I trust doubts this channel can grow. I don't. If stories like this resonate with you, subscribe and comment below. It really helps more than you think. Now let's begin. Everyone expected him to move. He didn't. Not because he couldn't. Young-jae had ended lives before. Quietly, precisely the way surgeons remove tumors. Violence had never been rage for him. It was mathematics. Remove the problem. Seal the gap. Move on. But he had walked away from that world the night Minji betrayed him. She had been his future once, his escape plan, the woman who knew every sin he carried and chose to sell them for power. He survived that betrayal by erasing himself, changing his name, his face, his purpose. Then he met Jada. She didn't know his past. She knew the man who cooked quietly, who flinched at sirens, who touched her stomach every night like he was asking permission to believe in tomorrow. She believed people could change because she lived like proof. And now she stood behind glass and fire because Minji wanted to know if Young-jae truly had. The fire wasn't meant to kill fast. Young-jae saw that immediately. Curtains first. Furniture legs. Flames kept low, smoke heavy, terror designed to stretch time. Minji wasn't punishing Jada. She was testing him. If he killed her now, here in the open, his past would rise like smoke. Police, media, the underworld would come knocking again. His child would grow up with a name that meant blood. Minji wanted him exposed. Jada's eyes locked onto his through the thickening haze. No accusation. No blame. Just trust. The kind that crushed harder than any flame ever could. Young-jae moved. Not toward Minji. Toward the window. The glass shattered outward as he threw his shoulder through it, slicing his arms without sound. Smoke swallowed him whole. He wrapped Jada in his coat, shielding her belly, counting seconds the way he used to count heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. They came out coughing, alive, collapsing into cold night air as sirens finally screamed in the distance. Behind them, Minji walked away untouched, and Young-jae let her. Because the fire wasn't what terrified him. It was the decision forming in his chest, the one that would take longer than flames, cut deeper than smoke, and leave Minji wishing he had killed her when he had the chance. The ambulance lights painted the street in stuttering red and blue. Young-jae sat on the curb, blood drying on his forearms, watching paramedics wrap oxygen around Jada's face. She was alive. The baby was alive. But something inside him had cracked open, and he couldn't stop the memories from bleeding through. Minji had known him when he still answered to his real name. She had traced the scars on his knuckles and never flinched. She had watched him disappear for days and never asked questions. She knew what he was, what he did, and she had smiled like it made her safer. They were supposed to leave together. New country, new names, a life built on silence and distance. Then she sold him. Not to the police. To his rivals. She had taken every secret he ever whispered in the dark and turned them into currency. He survived only because he moved faster than her greed. He buried Go Young-jae in an unmarked grave and became someone else. Someone smaller, quieter, forgettable. He thought he'd buried her too. But Minji didn't come back for love. She came back because she needed to know if the man she betrayed still existed. If the violence she once relied on was still coiled beneath his skin. The fire wasn't murder. It was excavation. She wanted to dig up the monster she remembered and prove to herself. And to him, that redemption was a lie people told themselves to sleep better. Young-jae looked up at Jada, still coughing, still breathing. Her hand rested on her belly, protective even in shock. She had trusted him. Not because she was naive, but because she believed the man he was trying to become was real. Minji knew that trust would be the sharpest blade. If he had killed her tonight, snapped her neck in the firelight the way his body remembered how Jada would have seen it, the baby would have been born into that image. His past wouldn't have stayed buried. It would have walked into every room his child ever entered. Young Jae exhaled slowly, tasting ash. Minji wasn't trying to kill Jada. She was trying to kill the lie he'd been living. And she had almost succeeded. Before he became nobody, Young Jae had been someone people whispered about in back rooms. Not because he was loud, because he was silent. In Korea's underworld, most men made noise to prove they mattered. They left bodies in public. They wanted credit. Young Jae had been different. He solved problems the way accountants balanced books, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. A rival disappeared on a Tuesday. A trader's car went off a bridge in the rain. No witnesses. No patterns. Just gaps where threats used to be. He wasn't a soldier. He was an architect of absence. People feared him because they never saw him coming. And the ones who did see him never talked about it afterward. Violence had never been personal for him. It was geometry, cause and effect. Remove the variable. Restore the equation. He didn't hate the men he killed. He didn't remember their faces. They were obstacles and he was the solution. But solutions have costs. Young Jae started noticing them in his late 20s. The way his hands didn't shake anymore. The way he could eat dinner an hour after ending a life. The way silence stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like erosion. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of how little dying seemed to matter. So he left. Not in violence. Not in betrayal that came later from Minji. He left because he looked at himself one morning and realized he'd become something that couldn't be loved. Only feared. Only used. He erased himself carefully. New papers. New city. A job that required no questions. He learned to cook because recipes had steps you could follow. He learned to sleep without checking the locks 3 times. He learned to smile at strangers without calculating exit routes. And then he met Jada. She worked at a bookstore. She talked about stories like they mattered. She asked him questions that had nothing to do with what he could do for her. When she got pregnant, she cried happy tears. And Young Jae realized he'd spent years forgetting that happiness could make people cry. She didn't know Young Jae. She knew a man who touched her belly like he was afraid it might disappear. That man was fragile, built on distance and discipline. One crack and the past would flood back in. Minji knew this. She had always known how to break him. Not with violence, he'd survived plenty of that. But with exposure. With proof that the man Jada loved was a performance. That the hands cradling her stomach had once ended lives without hesitation. Young Jae stared at the hospital doors, ash still clinging to his clothes. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a tightrope, and Minji had just set it on fire. Jada had never asked him about his scars. Not the ones on his knuckles. Not the faint line across his ribs. Not the way he flinched when police sirens passed too close. She noticed, he knew she did, but she never pushed. She had a way of waiting that didn't feel like judgment. Just patience. She was older than him by 3 years, but it felt like more. Not in her face, but in the way she moved through the world. Grounded. Unhurried. She'd lived enough life to know that people carried things they couldn't always name. She didn't need his past to trust his present. That had terrified him at first. If you still find this story interesting, let us know in the comment what you have to say about Young Jae's actions. Don't forget to subscribe as well because it really goes a long way. Young Jae had spent years building walls, and Jada dismantled them without trying. She talked about books like they were maps. She laughed at his cooking even when it was good. She fell asleep on his shoulder during movies and never apologized for it. She treated him like he was just a man. Not a ghost, not a weapon, not a mistake trying to correct itself. Just someone worth knowing. Their relationship didn't have grand gestures. It had routines. Morning coffee in silence. Grocery trips where she'd argue about which vegetables lasted longer. Nights where she'd read aloud while he listened. letting her voice replace the ones in his head. And every night before bed, he touched her belly. It started as a question. Is this real? His palm flat against the curve, waiting for movement. Proof that something good could grow from the life he was trying to live. She never told him to stop. She'd rest her hand over his and close her eyes, like she was giving him permission to hope. The pregnancy changed everything. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about legacy. A child didn't just inherit a name, it inherited a shadow. Young Jay had spent years trying to outrun his. But shadows didn't disappear. They waited. And if he slipped, if he became Go Young Jay again, even for a moment, that shadow would fall over his child before it even took its first breath. Jada believed people could change because she chose to see the man he was becoming, not the man he'd been. But belief was fragile. It required proof. And if he failed her now, if he let Minji drag him back into violence, it wouldn't just break Jada's heart. It would prove that everything they'd built was a lie. That the man who touched her belly every night had been a performance. That the father waiting to meet his child was just a killer on pause. Young Jay sat in the hospital corridor, head in his hands, Jada's heartbeat still echoing in his ears. If he crossed that line again, there would be no coming back. Not this time. Young Jay had seen fire used as a weapon before. Fast fires killed. They consumed oxygen, collapsed lungs, turned bodies into ash before pain could register. This wasn't that. The flames in that room climbed slowly. Curtains first, then furniture legs, creeping across the floor like something alive and patient. Smoke thick enough to choke but thin enough to see through. Heat that burned without devouring. Minji hadn't built a death trap. She'd built a stage. And she was waiting for him to perform. Young Jay's body moved before his mind caught up. Not toward Minji, though every instinct screamed for it. Toward the window. Toward Jada. He measured the distance in heartbeats. 3 seconds to reach the glass. 2 seconds to break through. 5 seconds to pull her out before the smoke became fatal. He didn't run. He moved with the precision he'd spent years trying to forget. The window shattered outward in a spray of glass. Shards bit into his arms, his shoulders, but he didn't feel them. He was already inside, smoke swallowing him whole. Jada's eyes found his through the haze, wide, terrified, but still trusting, still believing he would come. He wrapped his coat around her, shielding her belly with his body. Her weight against him felt impossibly fragile. He counted seconds the way he used to count exit wounds. 1. Her breathing shallow. 2. Heat climbing his back. 3. The door frame starting to buckle. They came through the window together, collapsing onto cold pavement. Jada coughed violently, gasping for air that didn't taste like death. Young Jay rolled to shield her from the glass, his hands checking her pulse, her stomach, the places fire could hide its damage. She was alive. The baby was alive. And 10 feet away, Minji stood watching. She hadn't moved, hadn't run. She stood with her arms crossed, firelight flickering across her face, waiting for him to do what she knew he could, what she needed him to do. Young Jay looked at her. Their eyes met. She smiled. Not from joy, from certainty. She thought she'd won. She'd proven that the man Jada loved was a lie. That violence was still his first language. That Go Young Jay couldn't stay buried. Young Jay stood slowly. Smoke clung to his clothes. Blood dripped from his arms. Every muscle in his body knew the next move. The way his hands would close around her throat. The angle her neck would break. The silence that would follow. It would take 3 seconds. He didn't move. Sirens wailed in the distance. Neighbors gathered on porches. Phone cameras began recording. Minji's smile faltered, just slightly, as if she'd miscalculated. Young Jay turned his back on her. He knelt beside Jada, checking her breathing again, his hands trembling now that adrenaline was fading. Paramedics arrived. Police asked questions. Witnesses whispered about the man who'd frozen, who'd let the woman responsible walk away untouched. They thought he'd been paralyzed by shock, by fear, by weakness. They were wrong. Young Jay had made a choice in those 3 seconds of silence. Not to spare Minji. but to destroy her in a way that fire never could. Death was mercy. What he had planned was something else entirely. Minji walked away smiling, believing she'd broken him. She had no idea what she'd just set in motion. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and fear. Jada lay in a bed too white, too clean, an oxygen mask fogging with each shallow breath. The doctors said she was lucky. Smoke inhalation, minor burns on her hands, elevated stress hormones. The baby's heartbeat was strong. They'd monitor her for 48 hours, then reassess. Lucky. Young Jae sat in the chair beside her bed, hands folded, blood cleaned from his arms but the cuts still visible. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Minji's hand on that lock, heard the click, felt the heat. Jada woke in fragments, coughing, gasping, her hands flying to her stomach before her eyes even opened. Young Jae caught her wrists gently, grounding her. "You're safe," he said. "The baby's safe." She stared at him for a long time. Her voice came out hoarse, scraped raw by smoke. "Why didn't you stop her?" The question hung in the air like ash. Young Jae had no answer. Not yet. Not one she'd understand. So he said nothing, and Jada turned her face toward the window, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Outside the hospital, the world was waiting for blood. Police came first. Detectives with notepads and tired eyes, asking questions Young Jae answered in careful monotones. Yes, he knew the woman. Yes, she was his ex-fiancée. No, he didn't know why she'd done this. No, he wasn't planning to press charges beyond what the state would pursue. The detectives exchanged glances. One of them, older, with gray at his temples, leaned in close. "If you're planning something," he said quietly, "don't. We'll handle this." Young Jae met his eyes. "I'm not planning anything." The detective didn't believe him. Nobody did. Word spread fast in the shadows Young Jae used to inhabit. Old contacts resurfaced. Messages appeared on phones he'd thought were disconnected. Men he hadn't spoken to in years sent quiet inquiries through intermediaries. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for Go Young Jae to rise from the grave and remind everyone why his name used to mean silence. Minji's people prepared for war. She hired private security, changed her residence, moved her assets into untraceable accounts. She gave interviews to sympathetic journalists, painting herself as a woman scorned, a victim of obsession. She smiled for cameras and slept with a gun under her pillow. She was ready for violence. Young Jae gave her nothing. No threats, no movement, no late-night visits or cryptic warnings. He went to the hospital every day. He sat beside Jada. He read baby books in the cafeteria. He existed in the smallest, quietest version of himself. People began to whisper, "He's lost his edge. Prison broke him. Love made him soft." Even Jada, lying in that hospital bed, couldn't hide the confusion in her eyes. She'd seen him move through fire without hesitation. But now he sat in silence, offering no explanation, no plan, no rage. "Are you just going to let her walk away?" she asked one night, her voice stronger now, sharp with frustration. Young Jae looked at her. "Would you want me to do something else?" Jada opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't know how to answer. She didn't know what kind of man she'd married or what kind of man she wanted him to be. Minji watched from a distance and saw exactly what she expected. A man defeated, neutered by love and law. She'd tested him and he'd failed. The monster she remembered had been replaced by something domesticated, something broken. She stopped checking over her shoulder. Her security detail scaled back. The gun moved from under her pillow to a drawer. She began appearing in public again, smiling wider, speaking louder. She gave an interview where she expressed concern for Young Jae's mental state, hoping he'd find peace. She believed she'd won, and Young Jae let her believe it, because silence wasn't weakness, it was patience. And patience, he'd learned long ago, was the cruelest weapon of all. Young Jae started with a name, not his own. One he remembered from years ago, a forensic accountant who specialized in finding money people thought they'd hidden. The kind of man who worked in shadows for clients who paid in cash and never asked questions twice. Young Jae called him from a payphone outside a convenience store. "I need you to find every account tied to CO Min-ji," he said. "Shell companies, offshore holdings, anything under aliases. I don't need access. Just proof." The accountant was silent for 3 seconds. Then, "I thought you were dead." "I was," Young Jae said. "Now I'm not." Min-ji had built her empire carefully. Legitimate businesses fronting illegitimate cash flows. Property holdings registered under corporate entities that dissolved and reformed like smoke. She'd learned from the best. From him once upon a time, and she thought that made her untouchable. But Young Jae had built those systems. He knew where the seams were. He didn't hire enforcers. He hired lawyers, investigators, tax specialists, people who lived in spreadsheets and legal code, who knew that the right document filed in the right courthouse could do more damage than any bullet. One by one, the threads began pulling loose. A shell company in the Cayman Islands flagged for suspicious transactions. An old partner, someone Min-ji had betrayed years ago, suddenly willing to testify in exchange for immunity. Property seized for unpaid taxes that had been cleverly deferred until now. Bank accounts frozen pending investigation. Nothing violent. Nothing dramatic. Just pressure. Steady. Relentless. Inevitable. Young Jae worked in the early morning hours, after Jada fell asleep. He sat in the kitchen with coffee going cold, laptop screen glowing in the darkness, building dossiers the way he used to build exit strategies. Every name, every transaction, every lie Min-ji had ever told documented and cross-referenced. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't even about what she'd done to him. It was about the smoke in Jada's lungs, the fear in her eyes, the way she still woke up gasping, her hands flying to her belly, checking for a heartbeat that fire had nearly stolen. His child deserved a world where Min-ji had no power, and Young Jae was going to give them that world, one legal filing at a time. Jada noticed the distance first. He was there but not present. He touched her belly each night, but his eyes were somewhere else. She'd catch him staring at nothing, jaw tight, the same look he'd had the night of the fire. "Are you sleeping?" she asked one morning. "Enough," he lied. "Are you planning something?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fear beneath the question. Not fear of what Min-ji might do, fear of what he might become. "I'm protecting you," he said quietly. That's not an answer. He didn't have one she'd accept. The space between them grew, not from anger, from something worse, uncertainty. She didn't know which version of him was real, the man who cooked breakfast, or the one who stared at spreadsheets in the dark like they were battle plans. Because they were. 3 weeks after the fire, Min-ji's accountant called her in a panic. Audits, investigations, subpoenas landing like grenades. Her carefully constructed empire was unraveling, and she couldn't see who was pulling the threads. She suspected Young Jae. Of course she did. But there were no bodies. No threads. No evidence of his hand in anything. Just her world collapsing in slow motion. And in the silence of his kitchen, Young Jae kept working. This revenge wouldn't end with screams. It would end with emptiness. Jada found the files on a Tuesday morning. Young Jae had left his laptop open, exhaustion finally overpowering caution. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for the grocery list. But the screen glowed with names she recognized. Min-ji's name, company registrations, legal documents annotated in his handwriting. When he came out of the shower, she was sitting at the kitchen table, the laptop between them like evidence. "Tell me," she said, not a question, a demand. Young Jae stood in the doorway, water still dripping from his hair, and felt the last wall between them crumble. So he told her everything. He started with his real name, Go Young Jae, a name that used to make men check their locks twice. He told her about the underworld, the bodies, the surgical precision with which he'd removed problems from other people's lives. He told her about Min-ji, how she'd been his future until she sold him for power. How he'd buried himself to survive. Jada listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the table, her face unreadable. The night of the fire, young Jay continued, his voice quieter now. I could have killed her. It would have taken 3 seconds. But if I had, his voice broke. If I had, you would have seen who I used to be. Our child would have been born knowing I was capable of that. And everything we built, everything I've tried to become, would have been a lie. Jada's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. So what are you doing now? With the files? The lawyers? Destroying her, he said simply. Without blood. Without bodies. So our child inherits my restraint, not my violence. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. You should have told me, Jada said finally. I know. I'm not afraid of your past, she continued, her voice trembling. I'm afraid of you carrying it alone. Young Jay looked up, something breaking loose in his chest. I thought if you knew, he whispered, you'd leave. Jada reached across the table and took his hand. I'm still here. 2 days later, Minji was arrested. Not quietly, not at night. In broad daylight outside a restaurant in Gangnam, cameras catching every second. Federal agents. Financial crimes. Charges that read like a novel. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, money laundering stretching back a decade. Her lawyers arrived too late. Her security stood by uselessly. The public watched as Seo Minji, always so composed, always so controlled, was placed in handcuffs and led into an unmarked car. Her empire collapsed in 72 hours. Properties seized. Accounts frozen. Associates turning on each other like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The media dissected her life in endless segments. The woman who'd smiled for cameras now couldn't leave a courtroom without being swarmed. Everything she'd built, gone. And through it all, Young Jae remained invisible. Minji demanded to see him. Her lawyer arranged it. One meeting supervised, in a cold room with concrete walls and fluorescent lights. She'd lost weight. Her hair, always perfect, hung limp, but her eyes still burned. Young Jae sat across from her, calm as glass. She expected rage. Gloating. Some kind of victory speech. He gave her nothing. Why? She finally asked, her voice raw. You could have just killed me. It would have been faster. Young Jae leaned forward slightly. You wanted fire. I gave you time. Minji's face twisted. Time for what? To realize that you didn't break me, he said quietly. You just reminded me what I'm capable of when I choose patience over violence. She laughed, bitter, broken. So this is mercy? Destroying my life piece by piece. No, Young Jae said, standing. This is protection. You came for my family. I made sure you could never do it again. He walked toward the door. Wait. He didn't. Minji sat alone in that cold room, the door clicking shut behind him, and understood for the first time what she'd really lost. Death would have been mercy. Death would have been quick. This, watching everything she'd built dissolve, knowing she'd done it to herself by underestimating the one man who truly understood her. This was something worse. This was erasure. And as the guards came to escort her back to her cell, Minji realized the cruelest truth of all. Young Jae hadn't destroyed her because he hated her. He'd destroyed her because she no longer mattered enough to hate. Young Jae drove home through evening traffic, his hands steady on the wheel. Jada was waiting. Their child was waiting. And for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. The fire was finally out. The baby was born on a quiet morning in April. No complications. No drama. Just Jada's hand crushing his, her breath counting down the seconds, and then a cry. Small and furious and absolutely alive. A daughter. Young Jae held her with hands that had once ended lives, and all he felt was terror. Not of enemies. Not of the past. Terror that he might fail this small, perfect thing that trusted him completely without knowing what that trust meant. She has your eyes? Jada whispered, exhausted but smiling. Young Jae looked down at his daughter, her tiny fists curled, her face still red from the effort of being born, and made a promise without words. You will never carry what I carried. Minji's trial lasted 4 months. Evidence mounted like stones. testimonies from former associates, financial records so damning even her best lawyers couldn't spin them. The media called it the trial of the decade, a fallen empress facing justice. She was sentenced to 18 years. Not life, not death, just long enough to watch the world move on without her. Long enough for her empire to become a footnote. Long enough for the people who once feared her to forget her name entirely. Young Jay didn't attend the sentencing. He was home, watching his daughter sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with a rhythm that still felt like a miracle. He walked away from power completely. The accountants, the lawyers, the investigators, he paid them, thanked them, and severed every connection. The laptop with the files was wiped and donated. The contacts who'd resurfaced were told, politely but firmly, that Go Young Jay was dead and would remain that way. Some didn't believe him. They waited for him to change his mind, to return to the world he'd once dominated. He never did. He stayed invisible, deliberate, a man defined not by what he could do, but by what he chose not to do. Jada asked him once, months after the trial, if he regretted it. "Regret what?" he said, rocking their daughter in the dim light of early morning. "Not killing her," Jada clarified. "When you had the chance." Young Jay was quiet for a long time, watching his daughter's eyes flutter in sleep. "I regret the years I spent thinking violence was the only answer," he said finally. "But not killing Minji? No. That choice gave our daughter a father who chose restraint when rage would have been easier." Jada leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "You think she'll understand that one day?" "Maybe," Young Jay said. "Or maybe she'll just know her father as the man who was there. And that'll be enough." Years later, Young Jay would still smell smoke that wasn't there. He'd wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, hands reaching for threats that no longer existed. Jada would pull him back, grounding him with touch, with breath, with the steady rhythm of their life together. And in the next room, their daughter would sleep peacefully, dreaming of things that had nothing to do with fire or blood or the weight of names better left buried. What Go Young Jay did next shocked everyone. Not because he burned brighter than his enemies, but because he chose to disappear completely, proving that the strongest revenge isn't destruction. It's living a life your enemies can no longer touch. Minji had wanted to expose the monster. Instead, she discovered something far more terrifying. The man who'd once ruled through fear had learned to rule through absence. And in that absence, he'd built something she could never destroy. The future. One morning at a time. The end.